I am officially losing my mind because today we are talking about why my Viper is not quite fast enough and I'm already considering modifying it. So with that said, let's get to it. Now this is the spring after I purchased the Viper. I bought it the tail end of last summer. It sat in storage for most of the winter, and now I've taken it out 1 or 2 times this spring. I put as many miles as I could before I put it into storage. So in the couple months that I had it, from the time I bought it at the end of summer to when I had to put it away in New Hampshire, I put somewhere around 600 miles on the car. And around 300 or 400 miles in, I was already getting used to the acceleration, and it was no longer completely terrifying me like it was the first week I had the car.
Holy shit! Oh my god!
With the miles I put on this spring, I put about 700 miles on the car so far. Even so, I'm already getting acclimated to the car, and I've been in a couple controlled environments where I've been able to push the car's limits, both in terms of acceleration as well as rolling on the throttle pretty deep through some corners and trying to catch the slide. Now, obviously, I have enough self-preservation that I'm not going to do this in a place where I would think I would hit anything or anyone. I'm not trying to crash the car. I have a little bit of an understanding of, the fact that I'm very much immortal at this point. But on the other hand, you got to know where the limits of the car are so that you can safely operate it in the event that you get close to them unintentionally. So for example, if you get caught in the rain, you start hydroplaning, maybe the tires are too cold and you aren't ready. You just got to be prepared in case something happens. That's how I like to test the limits of my car so that I can operate them more safely in the event that I do accidentally do something stupid in the future, which I've been known to do. That said, a big reason why I kind of realized that I'm very much immortal at this point is because I had a very bad head injury a few years back, and that took away a lot of my physical abilities. So now that I'm getting a little more acclimated to what this level of acceleration feels like again in an upright driving position, my body's kind of recalibrating, and then I'm also getting used to where this acceleration lies on the scale of what I've experienced before. And as I've said in previous videos, the Viper is also a vehicle to fill the void that was left by me pretty much no longer being able to ride motorcycles, especially not at the level I used to be able to. So those are disgustingly fast acceleration, to the point that even with like 7 to 8 years of riding experience on 1000cc liter bikes, which for anyone who isn't a sports bike person, those are like some of the fastest ones made. Even with almost a decade of experience riding those, including before the head injury when I could actually do things without, consequences, they are so brutally fast that at pretty much any speed, at any gear, if you go full throttle out of nowhere, not only do you have the risk of it flipping backwards and you really have to be in control from like a weight perspective, but also it's just so quick that it is legitimately terrifying. It is like actually fearful to go full throttle on those things. I genuinely question how I have lived this long doing some of the things that I've done on motorcycles. But for me, that's part of what made it enjoyable, was that slight element of fear and that concern that, okay, this could legitimately kill you, so you have to focus on exactly what you're doing now to be in complete control. Now, the Viper is really, really, really fast for a car. It is disgustingly fast. But as I've said, I have owned other high-performance cars in the past, so it's fast, but it is not that much faster than other things that I've owned and other things that I've driven. It's also not nearly as fast as the motorcycles, plus having a full body around me and having an airbag. That's more than I would get on a motorcycle, so there's a little bit less of that thrill and that sensation of fear, which is kind of weird to say, but something that I think I really enjoyed from the motorcycles. So even though I think it is really fast, even though I think it's super fun, it doesn't quite give me the same thrill it did in week 1, where I wasn't quite acclimated to it yet. And now that I have a more realistic grasp of how it is, I don't want to say I'm getting bored, because I'm not getting bored of it, but I am wanting a little bit more from the acceleration department, which is something I never thought I would say, especially after less than 1,000 miles and 8 or 9 months of ownership on a V10. And I want to be clear, it still lives up to my expectations in every way. I still love it in every way, but from an acceleration standpoint, I thought when I put it away from the winter and I was thinking like, oh, maybe I'm not that used to it. Maybe I'm just telling myself I'm used to it as it sat in my garage over the winter. But now that I've driven it a few more times again, it's like, okay, no, I wasn't really lying to myself and like saying I was used to it. I'm actually just kind of getting used to it. Now, the car does have high flow cats and a full catback exhaust, so I did figure that out. It does have factory headers still, but those are two mods that were done by the previous owner before I bought the car. And it does have a very healthy power band, and I do think it makes a few more horsepower than it did from the factory, as I've kind of discussed in another video. But furthering my kind of want and desire to modify this, beyond just wanting that little bit of extra fear in my life for no reason, is that my ultimate dream car, my ultimate version of the Viper, was the Gen 4 ACR, like a 2008-2009. And part of that is that the Gen 4s came with an extra 100 horsepower from the factory relative to the Gen 3, which is the one I have. So naturally, I did some research because I'm an engineer and I'm way over analytical of everything, and I found that while Gen 4s are already kind of out of my price bracket and that the car market in general is shifting upwards, so they are just going to get further and farther and farther out of my price range, the price for a few relatively simple mods is not terribly expensive. It's not cheap by any means, but it's nowhere near the cost difference of what I could sell that car for versus what it would cost for me to get a Gen 4. But in return, I would have Gen 4 power, I would have pretty much factory drivability and reliability, and I would still have the insurance rates of this one instead of the Gen 4, which isn't a huge difference. It's actually a lot cheaper to insure than I thought it would be, but in the grand scheme of things, it does keep the recurring cost of the car a little bit lower long term, which is also a plus for me. But beyond that, the ultimate version in my mind of what I pictured for my dream car was having forced induction at some point. Now, to be clear, I'm not ready to do that. I don't have the funds to do that, and I don't really have the skills to do that on my own, so paying someone else to do it is also way more money than I could ever feasibly have in the next couple of years. When I get there, I'll have to weigh, supercharger versus twin turbos, pros and cons of each, what's the cost of each. I haven't even really gotten to that point. That's more of like a long-term final setup I want to do on this car. But for now, the only mods that I really need to hit Gen 4 power levels, there's a couple relatively mild street cams that don't change low RPM drivability and really don't have a huge impact on idle. You need a new set of headers, which would complete the full exhaust system, but also you kind of need them for the cams, a new intake system, a new tune so it obviously runs properly with the camshaft, and then optionally you can also put on bigger fuel injectors, but depending on how much power you're really going for with the cam, factory injectors are probably fine at the 600 horsepower mark. And again, that's 600 at the crank, that's not 600 at the wheels. So it's not like a record power setup, but realistically in the ballpark of $3,000 to $4,000, I can realistically do the work myself. There's how-to videos out there with a really good amount of detail on how to do these, including the cam, and I will still have a reliable, streetable setup, but still has the horsepower numbers that I'm looking for. So that's kind of why it's really tempting, is I can do the work myself. I cannot buy a Gen 4 for $3,000 over what this car is worth. So on one hand, I'm like, $3,000 is a lot of money for me to be spending on the car, but it's very tempting knowing what I would have to pay for a Gen 4 and how much I want to keep this car long term. So if I wasn't planning on keeping this car for a long time, this wouldn't even be an option. So that's kind of where my head is at for why I'm trying to justify to myself that I can do this, even though it's probably not the brightest idea I've ever had. But to be realistic, I'm not going to do it at least yet. There's a few reasons. Then the first is I want more seat time.